Undergraduate Education. We're one of the co-sponsors of the Learn at Lunch, along with the Academic Advancement Network and OI3, and Jessica Garcia is here representing that office. So thank you for coming to the first Learn at Lunch. These are slated for every third Thursday this semester in this room, and hopefully for the whole year, because we love this room. Thank you to the library for everything. Before we kick it off, I just want to do a few housekeeping issues. We want to acknowledge that today is Rosh Hashanah, and not everyone can be with us today. And so to make this widely available to the whole campus community, we are videotaping it. And so thank you to Dave for coming in to videotape. And because we are videotaping, we would ask that when we get to the discussion part or question and answers, that people would come up and use the microphones just so that their voice is captured on the presentation. I also want to acknowledge that Dr. Gabe Ording is actually in class. So he is headed here from class, so he'll be walking in a little bit late. And then we'll have some handouts that kind of come around, and when Patty Stewart gets here from A&N, she'll probably also have a sign-in sheet, so we'll get that around, right? So I'm going to turn it over to Liz to kick us off, and I'm actually on the panel.
Directors in the Office for International Students and Scholars, and Jim asked me to moderate today's panel. We have faculty here with us who have some model practices on how to create inclusivity or create inclusive classrooms. In particular, when we're talking about working with international students, and we'll talk about what quote-unquote international students means. I will talk about that in a little bit here. Oh, it's this one? Okay, so our panelists today are Gabe Ording, who just came to us from class, as we explained, so thank you for coming. And Gabe is a faculty member in Integrative Studies and General Science. We also have Patricia Walters, who is the Associate Director of the English Language Center. And Jim Lucas is also on the panel, and he works with undergraduate education. And our sponsors, of course, are the Office of Inclusion and Intercultural Initiatives, the Academic Advancement Network, and the Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim really quickly to give an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, and particularly why this is important in our current times.
All right. It seems like there's a delay or something. Maybe it's in my brain. So in part, the reason the committee, so the goal of Learn at Lunch is to bring diverse faculty from across campus and staff to talk about teaching and learning environments from an inclusive perspective. And we know that since the last election, and that increasingly with DACA decisions, with travel bans, with Islamophobia, that our students face increasingly, our students of non-American citizenship face increasing perhaps obstacles to their feeling of inclusion on campus. We've already heard, for example, on campus, some of our African Muslim students have been heckled by people driving by in the car to the point where they don't feel comfortable wearing their headscarves anymore. So we think it's important from a very broad perspective to think about what does it mean to have multiple nationalities in the classroom. And by that we mean, in some sense, we're going to focus on international students, but we also could mean DACA students or students who do not have U.S. citizenship. And again, the goal of this is to not only hear from some people who have some thoughts and some examples and some provocative things, but to share with one another, to ask questions, and to really, as the name implies, learn over lunch about some of the issues associated with diverse nationalities in the classroom.
So the flow of today's session, I'll talk a little bit about what OISS is, in case you're not very familiar with what the office is and what the office does. Who are international students? When we say that, what do we mean as a campus? And I think it means different things depending on who you're talking with, what office you're working with. We'll have a panel discussion with tips for faculty and instructors on how to actually, do some things within your classroom to make it more inclusive. And then we'll have open discussion because I think that there's probably a lot of people, as Jim said, in the room here that have done things, have some ideas that would be really helpful to share with everyone. So I'll start with what is an international student? And again, I put that in quotes because I think it can mean different things for different people depending on what you're talking about. It can mean international students that are studying at MSU in F1 or J1 immigration status. So that would be, we often hear people say they're here on a visa or here on a study visa. It could be undocumented students. So these would be students at MSU who have no legal immigration status in the United States or congressionally legal status within the United States. Migrant students, these could be students that have legal immigration status in the U.S. They could be permanent residents, they could be citizens, they could be undocumented. And finally, students studying at MSU in other legal immigration categories. So that would be, dependents of H-1B workers. So faculty and staff, perhaps at the university, who are on an H-1B visa, their dependents might be studying here. L1, that's an intercompany transferee, business people who come to the United States as a part of their company to set up, a company office here, or maybe they're working for a multinational company. Their dependents might be studying here. Dependents of our J1 scholars and our J1 students. These are J2s. They could be studying. F2 dependents, so that would be spouse or children of our F1 students. We could also have the children and dependents of diplomats, artists, and any other A through Z immigration category that allows for study, full-time study, or part-time study. So then what does OISS do? So OISS is part of International Studies and Programs, and we report to the Associate Provost and Dean, Dr. Steve Hansen. Our office is located in the International Center. Our office serves international students and scholars in F1, J1, H-1B status, and their dependents, meaning spouse and children. We facilitate permanent residency applications based on employment at MSU. We provide immigration advising and facilitate MSU's compliance with U.S. immigration regulations. We conduct orientations, programming, campus and community outreach, all for the purpose of helping international students and scholars and their dependents adjust to life in East Lansing and at MSU. We contribute to the internationalization of MSU by providing opportunities and growth through cross-cultural interactions. So that's sort of our overall mission and what we do and our focus. So we don't work with migrant students. We don't work with undocumented students in particular. A word on migrant students, or not migrant students, undocumented students. At MSU, within SIS, the Student Information System, there's no marker for immigration status, right? There's no marker for whether you are in status, out of status, here legally, not here legally. There's just an indicator that you are a citizen or a non-citizen. So non-citizen could mean all of the things I just talked about. So when it comes to undocumented students, we don't have a list that I know of at the institutional level of students who are undocumented. So I know that that's a worry. People ask me that. As far as I know, there is no such list. Okay. These are just some quotes to kind of give you an idea of what ISP's mission and vision is. So these come from Dr. Hansen's statement on the website, on the ISP website. So we're looking to turn challenges and opportunities turn challenges into opportunities, not just for the university, but also for the world. So we're very global thinking, so the whole world. And we think about global engagement and looking beyond today, so looking into tomorrow. What is the world going to look like tomorrow? What are the needs that the world has? What are the big challenges? And we also focus on building a world that is sustainable, that has resilient communities, that will thrive for decades and years to come. This is nowhere on the ISP website, but it's something that the dean said to us during an ISP, all ISP update meeting, town hall, that when it comes to student learning and student learning goals, we're looking to foster globally engaged and culturally competent graduates overall. So that's sort of part of our core when we're working with students. In terms of statistics, there is a full report available on our website, and there's lots of, I call them tear sheets, so single sheets that have specific data about your college or about different student types. But overall, this is what it looks like. These are numbers from fall 2016. The fall 2017 numbers won't come out until the end of this month, and I won't have the statistical data report done until probably the end of the semester. But as of last fall, we had a 14% of the total population of students at MSU, grad and undergrad, 14% were international. For this report, international can mean more than just F1 and J1. I just want you to know that as well. So for our statistical report, it's not just the F1 and J1s that we work with. Okay. We have a majority undergraduate students, so 4,844 undergrads, 2,082 grads. And that's the total number as of last fall. If you look at our non-duplicated count from fall, spring, summer, it's more like 8,900 and some. So it's a much larger than this when you look at a whole year. This is a snapshot of fall. So I wanted to differentiate that for you as well. Regions of the world, you can see where most of our students come from: Asia, Middle East, Europe, Africa, Latin America. But you can see that the bulk of our students come from Asia. In terms of the breakdown of the top countries, China, India, Korea, those are our top sending countries. 74% of our international students, grad and undergrad, are from those countries. 27% study in the College of Business, so it's a pretty large percentage considering all the different colleges we have on campus. We have 133 different countries represented. This is, again, just the breakdown, grad, undergrad. We also have non-degree programs, so 338 students in non-degree programs. So what is that? Those would be like American Semester Program students who are here for a semester. They're not getting a degree. It also includes our VIPP, Visiting International Professional Program. So those would be professionals who come to MSU for a specific learning reason, and a special program or program of study is made for them. So that is what non-degree means. Enrollment trends since 1950. So you can see the growth from 1950 to our top, where we were in 2015, starting to kind of go down a bit. And it'll probably be a little bit lower even this year. So we might have reached a peak. Our top sending countries, you can see change over time, over the last few years. It hasn't changed a whole lot as you get down into the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They kind of rotate a little bit depending on the numbers that year. We've seen a significant drop in students from Saudi Arabia because of sponsorship. So the government of Saudi Arabia is no longer sponsoring as many students to study in the United States. We also saw a huge drop-off of students from Brazil. 2015, we had 91 students from Brazil. They didn't even make the top 10 last year. That's because of the Brazilian Scientific Mobility Program, which was a full scholarship program funded by the Brazilian government that no longer exists. So you can see how scholarship and funding, depending on the governments, when those come and when those go, that changes our student population somewhat significantly. This year, we have a special population of students from Malaysia. We had 60 Malaysian freshmen, or they're transfer students, so they're coming in at the sophomore level in sort of a dual degree or 2+2 type program. I'm not quite sure which one it is. But so that's gonna really bump up Malaysia. Malaysia's probably gonna move up a little bit. So we kind of monitor that to see sort of trends. So from that, I just wanted to give you an overview of international students at MSU, kind of, what is the population that our office is dealing with, keeping in mind that I don't have data on migrant students, I don't have data on undocumented students. So those exist in our population, and this, we will talk about that. We do need to consider those students when we're in our classrooms, especially in today's world. So now I'll turn it over to our panelists to talk about some of the model practices or radical ideas or thoughts that they have on creating inclusivity or inclusive classrooms. So I'll ask a series of questions, and then whichever one of you wishes to answer, just speak up. All right, so how do you introduce topics in your classroom that may be US-centric or Michigan-centric to ensure understanding among international students?
So actually, am I on? Yeah. This week I was teaching a small class of about 22, and I was talking about geologic time, and I brought a rock, and I've used this rock a lot in a class, and I'm guessing some of you might know what this rock is. Anybody know what this rock is? Raise your hand if you know what this rock might be. Anybody from a distance? Okay, it's a Petoskey stone, and I have used this a number of times. And what I did is I was in a class, 22 students, and I turned to this student, Peyton, who I've interacted with tons, and I said, Peyton, do you know what this is? And he said, it's a rock. And I said, yeah, it is. Do you know anything more about this? And he said, no, I don't. And I said, I realized immediately, I thought, oh, you're not from Michigan. And if you're from Michigan, you more likely know what this is than if you're not from Michigan. And I realized, you're not from Michigan, are you? And he said, no, I'm not. I said, oh, I'm sorry. And a student across the room said, Gabe, I know what that is. So Kelsey, what is this? That's a Petoskey stone. Exactly, that's a Petoskey stone, but she's from Michigan. And I then, foolishly perhaps, or not, I said, if you're from Michigan, this will make sense. I said, Peyton, do you know where Petoskey is? And he immediately said, why do people always do that? And I turned to the broader class, and I said, folks, explain why in Michigan we do this. And there was stone silence. And I realized, I said, wait a minute, raise your hand if you're from Michigan. And 3 people in the classroom were from Michigan out of 22. And all of a sudden I realized that my class, I was making assumptions about who was in my classroom, and I was trying to bring previous knowledge that they might have had, but they just didn't have that knowledge. Hi, Pinky. She's my neighbor. Why do we do this? So we talked about in the state of Michigan why this is a useful thing, but I hadn't realized how many students were out-of-state students. That had nothing to do with international students, but it really did make me realize relative to this discussion that many of us make assumptions about who our students collectively are, and we need to kind of frame our minds differently such that we can embrace the students who, yes, have the background knowledge that we might anticipate, but also identify some new knowledge to bring to the classroom to make more people feel included, if that makes sense. So Pat and I have actually been on panels together a number of times, and a theme that comes up for us again and again is much of the recommendations that we might make ultimately benefit all of our students, but some of the things that we'll talk about are intended to target and help creating inclusive environments for international students. So you want to jump off from there?
I just wanted to mention a little bit about making the assumptions, because I think something like the Petoskey stone or putting your hand up, those are things that once you get your mind going, you start realizing, oh yeah, this might be something I should be a little bit sensitive to. And so it really is just a habit of looking at your information in a new way before you present it to your students. But for example, first semester students coming from another country, even if they're highly skilled in their English, don't know a lot of things or don't know how to call a lot of things. So we just had an incident where we were telling the students, well, why don't you go home tonight and Google it? And it was some very basic information. We were sure that if they went home and Googled it, it would be the first thing that came up. They wouldn't even have to scroll down. And everyone came back the next day and said, I couldn't find anything. And the teachers were just really puzzled by it. And so we realized this idea of Google it I mean, they do Google something. What we use as the generic term to Google something, but the browsers that they're using, the format that it comes out in are all in, for the students that we were talking about, in the Chinese format or using a Chinese type of browser. And it really doesn't bring up the information. I mean, it's stuff that's completely irrelevant in China. No one in China would care about whatever the topic was. And so those are things that even for our teachers who generally are pretty sensitive about these things, suddenly we realize, oh yeah, there's a lot of steps that we can't make assumptions about. Even about what paper to buy to turn your paper in. What is an 8x11 paper as opposed to A4? What is it to turn in typed things on computer paper as opposed to loose leaf paper? What is loose leaf paper compared to the paper that you pull out of the binder? So these are things that seem so basic that we would be able to assume a first semester student would know, but it does start to wreak a little bit of havoc in the classroom when you're collecting papers and there are these little pieces of paper or you have to pull off all that. So I mean, talking about things deliberately and intentionally are a good way to start off the semester, even for high-level English proficiency students.
And I might also suggest that there's going to be things that we don't realize are problematic, and the only way that we can get around that is to get to know our students in a more meaningful way. And I think especially somehow reaching out to our international students to open up dialogue so that they feel comfortable coming to you and sharing what's going well for them in your class and what's not going well for them in your class. I know that I tend to speak rapidly when I'm excited about something, and certainly for an international student where English is not their first language, that can be a huge challenge. But I feel good that I am able to develop a relationship with students so that they can say, Gabe, you talk really fast. And I've created little signs with individual students. And actually this semester it's Diana, and Diana is waving at me. And I see it out of the corner of my eye, and I don't go any further than that, but she's waved to me, so I realize, oh, I've sped up, so I'm now slowing down. So getting to know our students and inviting them to share with us what we can do for them to facilitate their learning is a really important step.
And I'm just going to approach it from perhaps a little bit more of a meta level in terms of conceptually. I have an example that's similar to Gabe's, but I was working with a group of Chinese students, and we had gone to the UAE, and the faculty member was talking about the Arab Spring and the use of social media in promoting a liberal agenda, I would say, a national empowering the people, right, to take back the country. And there was an assumption, right, in that classroom that was desirable. And one of the Chinese students met with me, and she's like, when this is being talked about, you're assuming that we all buy into freedom of speech and we all buy into a liberal democracy. And she's like, I'm very happy with my government in China, and I'm very, it's a strong government. It takes care of us. It does what we need it to do. And you are assuming that we all buy in and agree with, the Arab Spring. And I thought that was very interesting that we bring, even if we're using perhaps diverse examples, we're bringing a certain worldview sometimes to our classrooms, and we're assuming that all the students in the classroom may agree with that. And I think that is something that we have to interrogate. And a very practical example was James Madison College, which realized that it was assuming that all of the students in the classroom grew up and then understood the American government system, right? That they just, by matter of course, you must understand the functioning of American government. Well, if you didn't grow up here, you probably don't know a lot about it. And then they realized that they needed to help their international students, or their students who didn't grow up in the United States with a U.S. government background, to kind of ramp up their skills, and if they were going to be successful in the classroom. So I think it's important, as kind of Gabe said, is not only do we have to think about the examples we use and trying to have a wide range of examples that target the diverse students in our audience, but we also have to think about the underpinning philosophy of what we're teaching, and we have to allow our students to feel safe and to give voice to divergent opinions. And I think Gabe put it really well, that in part means getting to know our students, or at least personalizing them without stereotyping them, right? Because we also don't want to get to the point where we call on the Chinese student in the classroom to speak for all Chinese students. That's not appropriate either. And I think then the other issue that's a little bit related to this is monitoring what students say when you bring up an issue. So I typically teach freshmen, but usually in the area of sustainability, which usually we talk about population, and it's hard to talk about population and not have discussion about one-child policy, and what does that dynamic look like? And I'll be honest, I'm teaching a class about Aquaman right now, which is hilarious, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. But we were talking about issues of the ocean, right, through Aquaman. And first day of class, one of my students said, I was asking them, like, what are some of the differences of opinion that might exist, right? We're talking about the ocean, so it's not like we're talking about something super controversial, but we're talking about the ocean. And the first thing out of one of my students' mouth was, well, those people in the Middle East are really into oil. So he's like, I imagine they would have a different opinion about offshore drilling than we would. So then it's right, I have to take a step, and I, acknowledge, okay, people have a different opinion about oil, but let's not stereotype the Middle East that they all somehow are related to the oil industry. And let's not stereotype that just because you may be from an oil-rich region. And, I said, Texas has oil, do you think? And then, there, of course, there's a student in class from Texas. And I'm like, oh, how are you? He's from San Antonio. He's doing fine. But, it's like, so I think it's not only the examples we use, but then when we create an environment where you're discussing issues, is that we have an onus to kind of interrogate when someone says something that could be viewed as, xenophobic or nationalist or racist. So that takes a little bit of skill.
Yeah, I just thought of it maybe a more provocative question along the same lines. So, when you're teaching, what do you think your role is, or the university's role is, in terms of teaching democratic values and citizenship? Is, and that sort of, I think it's hard to not bring that into the classroom and to not bring your personal opinions into the classroom. But, what do you think about that when you're teaching? Like when you had a Chinese student who said, yeah, I'm perfectly fine with my government. And I've heard Chinese students say to me, democracy's not all that great either, So what do you think about that?
Is it just me? Can one of them go first?
Of you.
Do you want me to do it? Okay. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I really struggled with because I really struggled with it. So effective citizenship is one of our university learning outcomes. And the way that I usually talk to faculty about it and the way I try to implement it into my classroom is it's not my job to tell you what to believe or how to engage as a citizen, but it is my job to encourage you to be thoughtful and knowledgeable and to make informed decisions for yourself about how you will choose to engage, right? Because they are going to engage politically, they're going to engage as consumers, right? They may volunteer, and it is a Spartan value and a university learning outcome that we're very, we dig in, we help try to solve the world's problems. So I don't view it, I try to be very careful with my students. I try to poke at both sides, right? So I try to say, if it was a political debate, I would try to poke at the Democrats as much as I would at the Republicans. I would encourage my students to vocalize both sides of the story. I would say, listen to both, make your own decision based on evidence, right? Don't just listen to the rhetoric. So I don't know if I've just weaseled my way out of that, but that's kind of how I...
It's a really hard question, I think, yeah.
I think at the English Language Center, of course, our main focus is to teach students academic skills. And so part of teaching them the academic skills to get into knowledge-based classes like the ones that you might be teaching is to think critically. And so when you hear something, what is it to then think about the other side? So we do a lot of exercises just trying to get students to read something and then criticize it, which is a very difficult skill for a lot of these students. It's not just an English language matter. It really is that idea of, well, a famous person said this. Why would I criticize it? But to let them know that they can do it. It has to be a thoughtful way. They have to have supporting points to back it up and whatnot. But those are the kind of things that I think we do. So we're sort of kicking the can down the road so that they can engage with all of you in the knowledge-based courses and hopefully come away a little bit more able to make their own thoughts.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind, I think, with this sort of topic is, or this question, because to be successful in our classrooms, you have to understand the teaching and learning styles that we use in the United States. And so the thing that comes to mind is both and with our students. You know, you can adjust to American culture and also be true to your own culture and true to your own values. And so
There's a question I want to get that, but I think to that point is that some of our students are coming from cultures where they're not allowed or don't think it's appropriate in a classroom context to vocalize their opinion. And so, you know, whether it's individually in office hours and an advising meeting in the classroom is allowing the students and letting them know that they can say that they, and then they're not going to be penalized for it, right? So yes, you can stand up and say, you know, I disagree with this policy, or my experience differs, and that actually enriches, right? That's the plurality of voices that we're looking for. So giving them space is important. Did you?
Thank you. And I think it's really interesting what's happening here is that by doing these things, we are actually modeling our values of free speech and democratic process, even though we may say we may not promote them explicitly in words, but that is what our classrooms do. And I don't think we can stop doing that.
I don't think, and I wouldn't put a value judgment on it either. I wouldn't say it's good or it's bad. It's just, I think, something to be aware of. Yeah.
Thank you. I feel sometimes, you know, when we teach with the values. We don't teach value, but we teach with the values. I think being self-aware of the process is very, very important. And for example, we say rote learning is bad. That's our assumption, right? You know, we want social construction of knowledge. That's a democratic process as indicated in teaching and learning in this context. And we assume that rote learning is bad. I was originally from China, and I studied in Australia. I worked in New Zealand before I come to complete the PhD here. I have experienced different mode of learning. Recently, I reflect on that rote learning. I think we don't understand the rote learning, the value of rote learning, because the philosophy is very different. When we teach children in that tradition, it's really, we think kids wouldn't understand. But if they remember this when at the golden time, when their memory is the best, and then they reflect what's been taught throughout their life, one day they might understand, oh, this is what it means. For example, fasting, okay? So in Chinese, there's 2 words for heart fasting. You fast with your heart, okay? 心斋. So I reflect on this. I didn't get it in the past. I thought it's just something flashy there. But recently I understand, because I did yoga, I did meditation, I understand, oh, that is a very different philosophy about the existence, about our experience. It's all from our heart, all from our mind. If we fast with our heart and mind, we really get to the essence of the universe, of our being, of our life. So root learning, we assume, and we have a lot of assumptions in our teaching. We have to have that because it doesn't matter which culture we come from. You always have that because you are shaped in that culture, in that context. I think it's critical to become self-aware, and then we know where other people come from and bring that onto the table as well. Sometimes I think because the fear we have, we don't allow the difference to become a teaching resource for everyone in the learning community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to tell Gabe I carry a Petoskey stone in my pocket as I'm from Petoskey.
Outstanding.
You're welcome. You're welcome, and I'm not a plant in the audience. Liz, I appreciate your question because actually, with my role at the university, our office is actually teaching core democratic values and constitutional principles, U.S. constitutional principles. So we're actually teaching them explicitly. And for those who don't know, my name is Rick Schaefer, Associate Director of Student Conduct and Conflict Resolution. So for some of you, sometimes there's behavioral issues. You might be referring them to our office. Some already have, including Dr. Ording. But the reason I wanted to comment is that where this issue about understanding comes up for us is the idea, so we're an individualistic-based society where we have many students coming from communitarian-based societies. The idea of having individual rights in some respects is so unusual that even the idea of teaching it explicitly is lost. Like, what do you mean I have rights? I mean, we have international students who come in and say, I didn't do this, but I will accept responsibility because I don't have any choice. That's what I've been trained and taught to do. So I guess one of my questions is, and I don't know if international students and scholars would be the place to go, but are there people that we could maybe send some of our written material to, scripts that we use, for example, in hearings, formal hearings, to help us find better ways to explain some of our processes? Because it's very clear that some of the words that, based on your earlier premise, we assume everybody knows what this word means, but they clearly don't. And in fact, it may feel disrespectful for the student to even ask what that means. So I'm looking for some help. It's part of the reason I'm here, is to look for some ways in which we might better communicate our written pieces, and then also perhaps to work on some collaborations around students who might feel, despite the fact that they've passed the TOEFL, really could use some interpreting help, and frankly help us to do a better job of explaining our process and understanding what the student is telling us.
Yeah, we'd be more than happy to look over any materials that you or anyone else has. I think that I'd like to have Patricia, call her Pato, I think many of you know her as Pato, look at some things as well from this English as a second language learner perspective. I think is really helpful. You don't have to go with our recommendations because, again, my frame, the way I view the world is through the world of international student and scholar services and their needs and challenges. Interestingly enough, so yes, on that definitely we can figure something out. Secondly, actually in a couple of weeks on October 1st, Hirsch, Sodia, and I are doing a training for the ASMSU student advocates who go with the students to the hearings. And the questions that they had were similar along your lines. I think, in particular, they're concerned with Chinese students and the understanding of English language. So we're preparing that discussion. And the one thing about English language, and I know this is not on this panel, but there are studies that show that English language ability, we and the person who is speaking tend to see that as the main barrier for communication, but there are studies that show that it is not. That it's actually the lack of training in how to listen and how to listen from the part of the person who is the native speaker, and then for the speaker, how to become more confident in their ability. I had a student in my office who I thought I couldn't understand at all, and usually that doesn't happen. I had to call in one of my staff members that spoke Chinese to translate, because I thought we're not communicating at all. And then as it turns out, after the other staff member left, I said, "Do you want me to close the door?" And she said, "Yes." I closed the door. And then we started talking. She spoke nearly perfect English. And so I asked her, what happened? I've seen you change in just this 1 hour conversation. And she said, "I don't feel confident in talking, so I just don't, because I don't think you're going to understand me." And I think that comes from the psychological part of so many people sort of not understanding or not giving the time to try to understand. So it's just something to keep in mind as well. I think that there are students that definitely do have language, that is the main issue, but just keep that in mind. So I'll move on.
Well, I just wanted to say,
Yeah.
since Rick brought up the issue of resources, obviously OISS is a resource. They have a student group, the International Student Association, that sometimes we bounce ideas off of or get their opinion. And I do think they meet, the Friends of OISS meets, and some of your colleges have representatives, but I think it's always good to have a champion somewhere around you that can remind you about international students, because I think sometimes it's a forgotten diversity issue on our campus, and we make plans or we do something and we don't think about that population. Also, I don't know, Pato, do you want to talk about what your office has been doing?
Our office offers, what am I doing? Our office offers several different resources, and we do actually go into classrooms if an instructor invites us to come in to observe a class or to observe interactions, to give our feedback on what we think might be a problem happening if the communication isn't going well. But one of the things for Rick, there are various tools online that can help with this type of matter. So there's a website which I can share with everyone later somehow when we send the information. It's called LexTutor. It's a website that's out of Canada. But anyway, you can actually put in texts, different kinds of text, and put it in there, and it analyzes it for you so that you can see where the vocabulary lies. And there are things called the General Service List, which is the 1,000 most common words used in English, and the next 1,000 most common words used in English. And if students can master this first 1,000 and second 1,000, they usually can understand over 80% of everything. Then after that, there's a set of words called the academic word lists, and those word lists are by different genre. And again, that will add another 5 to 10% of vocabulary. So after students master this basic word list, and some students will do it very methodically, but it really is just a general awareness of English language, then they can get into this AWO. But what's good about this is then you end up with, it will identify words that aren't on the general service list or the academic word list. So they're non-listed words. And those are the words that you, as you might need to target, or like in your field, field-specific words that don't come out in these generalized words. Those are the ones that you would make a glossary for example. So they're words that are important for your subject area, and students should get to know them if they want to become a biologist or a psychologist or whatever, but it helps you identify those words very easily. So I can share that with you.
And in fact, there's a link where you can submit your documents to have them be analyzed to see to what degree they are user-friendly for other people. And you can identify, it's really valuable for us to submit our own, a test or an exam or an essay that we're asking students to read, to identify how user-friendly is that. And then, and it really is. So we can adjust what we utilize in the creation of our own documents, same way.
Great, yeah.
I kind of going off of that conversation, I want to always talk about from being in the trenches, working with students in large lecture classes. So I teach 180 students at a time, and there's lots of students who might quietly sit back and keep hidden and not get the help that they need. I've taken to, in my syllabus, I've always had a little paragraph that says, oh, RCPD students, if you're registered with RCPD, please come and see me within the first 2 weeks of class so we can talk about any accommodations you might need. We can do the same thing for international students and say, international students, if you are in my classroom, I recognize that you might have challenges different than the domestic students. Please, I want you to come to my office so we can talk about what I can do differently in my class to facilitate your learning. This semester, first week of class, I had a young woman arrive at my office, and she's from China, and she's describing concerns about her language abilities, and she said, can you do anything for me? And I said, would you like my lecture notes early? And she said, that would be incredible. So what I'm able to do for her is give her a mock-up version of my lecture notes ahead of time. She's able to review them and identify those disciplinary words that she just doesn't know, and she's able to come to me during office hours before class or with my ULAs to get support on what those words are, so that when that lecture actually arrives, she's going to feel more confident and ready to go. And she's very excited about that. That's working well for her. And a specific example I have relative to Chinese students is several years ago, I had a couple of Chinese students who were coming to my office hours together, and they were identifying there was these big disciplinary words, and they were having a hard time with them. And we ended up together working out this list of words that was disciplinary. They ended up identifying the appropriate translation, because if sometimes people using translators will use a word, and the translation that they'll get back has nothing to do with the class. It's just not well aligned. We were able to develop a list of biological words that had, and we got the Chinese translation, and that list actually kind of evolved over the course of a few semesters, because I was able to hand that off to other Chinese students who were in the class, and they added words to it. And that list grew for a while. I then had a group of Saudi Arabian students who were saying, do you have a list for us? And I didn't. But they then began one in the course of that semester within their group, which was really wonderful.
Along these lines of, oh, sorry.
No, I think I'll lead in for you. Gabe just triggered something in my head too, that I think some of you, I know, teach in a non-classroom environment, or you may do student activities, or you do education abroad. And I just want to extend that some of the things that we're talking about does extend to those environments. So for example, I had a group of migrant students I've had this with migrant students, and really, to be honest, students from urban areas in some cases. So on study abroad, for example, riding a bike, right? I just got back from Japan. I had 20 students. 4 of them had never ridden a bike before. Okay, swimming is a big one, right? So I go to Australia, we go on the reef. In my experience, a lot of the migrant students, they don't know how to swim. I've actually taught several of them how to swim, right? So I think the other thing, and again, this is broad, it's not just international students, it's just not, but students of differential backgrounds. I think in Michigan, we assume everyone knows how to swim because we're a Great Lakes state or whatever, but students today aren't necessarily urban students. They couldn't afford a bike, or they maybe lived in an area where they couldn't bike, or it's just not something that their parents did. Generally, kids, they're on computers more, they're not outside, they're not engaged. So even from a physical activity standpoint, when you're starting to plan activities or things that students should do, you have to be mindful of, I think, different ability levels that can be translated back to background. So, because that's all part of the inclusive community.
yeah. So in terms of that inclusive community, and when we're thinking about cultivating a learning community within your classroom that attends to diversity and is inclusive of all students in your room, one of the things that comes up a lot among students and faculty, I think, as well, is, what are some techniques to, for instance, diversify group makeup during group work in your classroom? How do you tackle that? What do you do?
So I'm looking at Anna, right? Anna's she's a faculty teaching in our ISB program, and in smaller classes with 26, 27 students. And in that context, they actually, in those classrooms, they do a lot of group work. And it might be that you allow your students to naturally form their own groups in a classroom, but I've walked into large lecture halls where there's just a natural affiliation. There's a cluster of 10, 12, 15 students who look similar, and they've just kind of self-chosen to be in that area. As a result, the group that they would form, allowing it to just happen naturally, is not going to be very diverse, and they'll be surrounded by people just like them. And that's comfortable, but that doesn't help us accomplish the mission of benefiting from the diversity in our classrooms. So I think with mindfully and intentionally crafting groups, you can do it randomly, and then that randomizes and scatters the diversity across the room. Jim, though, has identified that might, completely randomly, you might end up leaving some folks in groups alone.
Good point.
Yeah, we were talking about this yesterday. So one of the things that I've read, and one of the things I tried to do, is I try to not, if there were 2 African Americans in the room, I wouldn't put them in 2 separate groups. I'd put them together. So if it was a group of 4, it would be 2 African American, right? Or I try to not put just 1 woman or 1 man in a group. And the same thing with international students. So I think if you can, you might put 2 international students, 2 domestic students, right? Instead of just, sometimes we want to try to sprinkle the diversity out as much as we can, but for affinity's sake, if you're the only one that's different, if it's 3 white students and 1 non-white students, or 3 women and 1 man, or 3 men and 1 woman, that can be challenging. So I try to do it somewhat randomly, but also cognizant of partnerships, right, in groups of 4. So.
Kind of like the theory of, challenge and support happening right then and there. It's challenging, but yet still in a supportive environment. Yeah.
And then later in the semester, you can also revamp the groups again. After there's a sense of community that's been developed and a sense of comfort level, you can gauge that as the semester goes along.
And I think you can also be intentional about, once you have the groups, giving them the idea of what they should do. So of course you have them in groups to do a discussion, but what does that discussion entail? I know for international students that's really hard, like when is it that I get to speak, or how do I do this? So especially at the beginning of the semester, if you do make roles, like who's the group leader, who's the note taker, who's the person that makes sure everyone's taking a turn, there's these artificial roles you can create and sort of train them the first 1 or 2 times to do it, and then it just makes them be able to get into the meat of the matter much more quickly than just sitting around wondering, well, who does what am I supposed to do, and then again having no confidence in language.
Good. When it comes to the classroom and the syllabus and how the course is going to be taught, how you expect students to do the learning, how do you go about teaching students about the syllabus and what's expected of them, and also teaching about your teaching methods and your expectations of the learners?
I will point out, I'm involved with the International Student AOP process, so actually, Mary Beth, hi. And Mary Beth has structured a program associated with the International AOP where syllabus, talking about the syllabus is a major theme. So in theory, international students, when they go through the AOP process, are to a certain degree trained about the importance of the syllabus and what the syllabus allows for. I'm not sure if the data exists yet, Mary Beth, to show whether that intervention is having the desired effect, but it certainly is important. And again, this is for our international students and our domestic students to recognize that this is a contract with the faculty member, and the faculty member has to follow through with what's in there. And you should immediately pull out your planner and use the dates that are significant there. This is an international student issue, but it's a domestic student issue too. We all need to talk about our syllabi more.
Yes.
And quiz them on our syllabus is an effective way to get them to pay attention. So.
Yeah, do you deal with the teaching and learning methods in your classes? And how that might be different from what your students have grown up with or expect?
Yeah, so just building off what Gabe said, there are units on campus who are starting to do syllabi quizzes. I always tell, like when I teach a class and the student asks a question, I'll be like, check the syllabus. I think if you do that for about a week, then they learn to check the syllabus. So I do think it's important to teach all students. I think this is just a general student issue right now, is being mindful of the syllabus. But I do include in my syllabus my expectations for engagement and discussion. What does respectful discussion look like in the classroom? What are my expectations of how we interact with one another? what does it mean to participate? If I give participation points, what does that mean? What are the behaviors that I'm looking for? And in doing that, I think especially is to have multiple types of ways to participate. So I think a lot of time we think of participating as raising my hand and talking in front of the whole class. And I try to help the students understand that, well, that's part of participation, but there can be participation online, there can be participation with me one-on-one in office hours, there's participation in small groups, inside and outside of the classroom. So I try to acknowledge that our students are diverse and they're not all going to be able to participate in the same way, while also encouraging them to participate in multiple ways, because we do live in a society where we do have to stand up sometimes and vocalize our ideas in front of groups. And so, you know, I typically work with freshmen, so I'm trying to kind of nurture that and give them multiple opportunities to succeed with clear guidelines. And for those of you who aren't familiar, A&N does have a syllabus checklist of, it has what's required as an institution that we include in our syllabi, but also other policies and procedures that it recommends. So I always pull, you know, grief absence, RCPD, you know, I pull those things right off the university websites and I put them in there so the students know what the policies are. And then I have mandatory reporter is in there. I have inclusion and harassment is in there. So I put all of these things in there and we talk about them and we talk about why we're doing them. And I try to build them in to the activities of class. So like in the syllabus, it says this. Why do you think we're talking about it, right? So it's not just words on a page.
Let's see.
Are there any questions out there maybe before
Yeah, maybe we do that right now, yeah.
Anything anyone wants to share? Because we can just keep talking.
Well,
Francis.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Francis Kanen. I'm an academic advisor. And the reason I came here is because just within the last 2 weeks, I've had students come to me with issues, international students. One of them was regarding a group discussion, and she said, the teacher did exactly what you said, or the student dealt with it. If she didn't understand anything in class, she always knew she had this faculty member's notes to fall back on. But in group session, she didn't have anything because the students speak too fast, and she did not know how to handle that. I mean, she brought it up to the faculty member, but that seemed like it broke down. The faculty member was not able to communicate that to the group. So a student felt very frustrated. So that was one group. Another group was just Monday. 2 students came to me and they said they're actually from Rwanda, and they're in a food science class, and they said they felt very uncomfortable even asking questions because they were talking about franchises and naming restaurants like Taco Bell, McDonald's, Applebee's, and Subway, things they really knew nothing about. And it would have been helpful had that faculty member given them notes, or at least told them, or somebody addressed the fact that those are known entities to domestic students, but very foreign. So they're dealing with something that's not even part of the content of the class, but they can't even get past that. And they felt very frustrated about this. I don't know how to handle that, but maybe notifying faculty members that what may be normal to domestic students, now that we're getting more international students, may not be normal to those. I responded by, how can I be helpful? And they said even just seeing them would be good. So I took them in my car the next day and we drove around. We went to an Applebee's, we talked to the general manager there, and I took them to a Subway so they could see what, but that's just a little bit of it, and just for 2 students, and I'm sure this is a problem for many other students. So how would you handle things like that?
It gets to be difficult in that I've begun to weave in examples of environment. I teach an environmental science class, so I bring in insect examples from around the world, and I'll bring in issues of deforestation or reforestation and innovative activities that are taking place in China and in Africa and in South America, and I better include Malaysia now, and it gets tough to make sure you've got an example that makes everyone feel represented, because it gets tough. But I think if students recognize that we are trying to incorporate multiple examples that represent more than just the United States perspective, and again, we need to help our students feel comfortable to come visit us in office hours so that a frustrated student can directly say to the faculty member, you're using examples I'm not familiar with, can you help me to understand that? And my classmates talk too fast, can you help in that regard? Because that's really our responsibility, is to facilitate the learning, and we need to act as, if we're asking them to do group discussions, we need to moderate that to a certain degree to make sure that it is effective. So.
How would you tell domestic students that they're speaking too fast? Like, what would be some techniques to
I've
go
said
about doing
things
that?
to large, again, 190 students, saying we need to recognize that we have diversity amongst us, and I know myself that I talk too fast. And especially when we're having a focused conversation about something that's really important, we all need to try and slow down, not only for international students, but for domestic students too.
So sort of building that into class
Processing speed,
expectations.
yeah,
Like, this
just
is
to
how our
slow down a
class-
bit. A recent quote that actually Anna Ryan heard from someone, that we need to listen, not to react, but listen to understand. And I think that goes also with regards to how we deliver a message of importance, that we need to thoughtfully choose our words and approach it in a pace that everyone has a chance to digest what we are saying and what does it really mean.
I would also say that, I mean, I think it's multiple levels, because I think anytime you ask a question about a specific context, the answers are contextual. So I think as a teacher, you know, your point is, I think Subway is pretty all over the place, but even Applebee's, I might be from a part of the country that doesn't have Applebee's. So I think as a teacher to remember, as kind of where we started this session, is to use multiple examples that are diverse, to pay attention, to check for understanding, and, you know, I try to give my students a baseline of knowledge. So, you know, we laughed earlier, Aquaman. I have 2 young men in the class who are total comic book geeks. They could, like, run the class. And then I have students in the class who just took it because it's a freshman seminar and it had the comic book in the title, and they've never read Aquaman. So on the first day of class, I gave them an assignment to do before they came to class, right, to level the playing field. They had reading to do, so they could all talk a little bit about Aquaman. So I think if I'm going to talk about franchises, maybe it should be in the reading, it should be something the students have prepped, so that I'm building off of at least a baseline, and then I can use diverse examples. Can also use classroom assessment techniques, whether you use clickers or use, you know, a 5-minute paper at the end of the class to check for understanding. And if you start to see that some of your students aren't understanding what you've talked about, or they can't apply it, then you know that you need to course correct. I think also, you know, working with Pat O's office to check curriculum, or, and then, you know, I think we sometimes shy away from the idea of hiring undergraduate or international ULAs, but hiring a diverse group of undergraduates to help be our undergraduate learning assistants can help, right? Because they can bring a diverse perspective to us when we're teaching. And then also, as Gabe has said, having that relationship with the students so they know to come talk to me. 2 things that I've done specifically. Have the groups have to produce notes. So if you have to produce notes of your group discussion, I have evidence that you were on topic, but you also have something to give to each student to walk away from. Embed, you know, communication as a learning outcome for your class. I've had conversations with engineers who say, well, we don't do anything with intercultural or cultural understanding. I said, do you put your kids in groups? Yes. If you put your students in groups, and they're diverse groups, there's some cultural understanding happening. They need to learn to talk to each other. That's a life skill. So I see you can build it into the actual pedagogy of your course. I had a class once where, you know, you're all gonna get the shivers, but I had 5 international students, 5 migrant students, and 5 James Madison students. Discussions were heated about things. What? I'm not going to answer that question. But the point was, there's a big dichotomy in the classroom around writing. And so what I actually did is I partnered, and you might, I'm not making any assumptions. I took the writers who had done the best and the writers who needed the most work, and I partnered them. And I said, co-write a paper. Every group who took that seriously, the paper they produced was better than their individual previous grades. I had a couple groups who didn't like the idea of group work. But what I was trying to show them is that they all had something to contribute, and that some of them were better at the writing of the English language, but some of them had really super great ideas that they were just struggling to get out on paper. So by making them work together, I was trying to get them to respect one another and listen to each other one more, and it actually helped the class moving forward. So I think being willing to do a course correct when you see something happening in your classroom, and being willing to take that on as a teacher is really important.
Great, thank you.
Have the student go to the faculty member. That's the point. But what else can a student do? They came to me as the advisor, and so short of telling them, make sure you go talk to the faculty member, which is what I told them, and they said the person was not helpful. What else? What other suggestions? Yeah. The faculty member.
I tell faculty what to do, not students. No, I'm just kidding.
I've received many calls from advisors seeking help. I would encourage you to reach out to the faculty member and just say, you should know you've got students in your class and they've identified a challenge they're experiencing. And again, I hope that they would be very receptive to a phone call from an advisor, reaching out on behalf of students. That's why we're here. So.
I've had students ask me if they could record conversations so they could go back and review it, and they ask me and I say yes or no. That could be another technique, but I do think just referring them to the faculty, because I guess the reason I went with the faculty member has to make the classroom a place where the students can learn, and it really has to, I don't know, other than trying to have someone take notes for them or something, like, I don't know what the student can do on their own without talking to a faculty member. And I have found, Gabe and I are working on a cohort program for first year students, and believe me, I'm getting a lot of emails from parents, more than I should. I find that the faculty are very gracious about, and what we're trying to role model, right, is the faculty and the student talking to each other, because the students have to learn to solve their own problems. They can't go to the parents and they can't go to the advisor, they have to go to the faculty member. So I'm always trying to promote that, like, talk to your faculty.
I've sat down with students with that same situation of, feeling like either they were afraid to go to talk to the faculty member. It could have been a cultural difference in terms of how you speak to someone who you perceive as a higher level than you. But what I've had them do is we'll practice a situation, like, okay, let's pretend that I'm the faculty member, and let's go through a practice situation of you actually asking the questions, how I might respond. So it gives them a little bit of practice doing that. I also do that when students are afraid to tell their parents about things that have happened to them that are not great. We will do some role playing where I play the parent, they play the student, and we go through different scenarios of how their parent might react. And you do different scenarios, like the angry faculty member who doesn't care about you at all, or the faculty member who doesn't know how to help, or the faculty member that we hope for, which is super helpful. So again, it's helping the students who learn how to do these things, because as adults we know we have to do this all the time, in our lives. So I know Mary Beth, you had a question.
Can you use the mic just because it's being recorded? Thank you.
Jim, you mentioned context, and Gabe, you mentioned not only the what, but how to respond. All right. I feel like I should sing or something. But not only the what in terms of delivering a message to the students, but the how. And I think, and Liz, you mentioned fear, how the students feel. I think presenting ourselves as human beings who are also vulnerable, like it is hard for me sometimes to understand other languages. Like I've said that to my class. So we all need to speak slowly. It's a model a way to be vulnerable, and also to get our message across that we need to, I'm going back to the thought about speaking more slowly. Like you said, I also speak fast. We need to speak more slowly. I think just letting our students know that we also need to check ourselves, or to tell a story, like going to France for a year, this is true, and not being able to understand a thing, and how upsetting that was, you know, for a year. Like to share something, maybe it's not going to France, but there's a lot of things that we can't understand. Sometimes I can't understand English, you know, and how that makes me feel. It might be a math class or something. I think that's important for our students to know.
Well, I think that's an important point that Mary Beth's making, and I think the essential part was when she said being human, and that was another point that we talked about yesterday, is being willing, as a person who works with students, to perhaps be vulnerable yourself or to put yourself out there to make very human comments. And I think we're all so afraid of offending, and obviously we don't want to offend, and obviously we don't want to be political, or we don't want to be biased, but it doesn't take a lot to say, you know, I know that there are people from Texas and the Caribbean in the classroom, and I'm thinking of you and your families right now because of the earthquakes or the hurricanes. Or to say, what a tragedy that happened in Charlottesville, and I think that as Spartans we can do better, and then we can be more inclusive than that, right? Like, you don't have to be, you know, we don't want to be political, we don't want to foist opinions on our students, but I think we can say the things that are human to make our students know that we see them, and that we are people too, that they can come and talk to, because a lot of what we've been talking about rests on the fact that students are willing to come and talk to us, or willing to express their needs to us.
And that, just along those lines, and then we'll get to another question back there, but we had talked when we were prepping for this session about, you know, trying to avoid singling students out, whether that's in a positive or a negative way. You know, try not to look at a student, assume they're from a certain country, and say, well, how do you do it there? That's something we need to be sensitive about, especially in today's era of nationalism and all of that. There are people in our classrooms that don't want to be identified by where they're from, what country they're from, what religion they practice, whether they have immigration status or not. So I think that kind of brings that up too. And I know you had a comment back there.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk about one of the common frustrations that I hear from the students, and this is in regard to my business.
Yeah, they're just recording it, so
Yeah.
So one of the common frustrations is around the content that the students learn in class. Let's say they are talking about the U.S. politics, and this student is, let's say, from Africa or somewhere else, and they are not familiar with the U.S. Politics. And I do ask them to request the teacher if they could be allowed to write a paper on something that they're familiar with. And I'm just curious on how the faculty are open to these kind of, alternatives.
I always encourage students to be able to investigate something that they're more excited about. And I think oftentimes it is allowing a student to do a project on something closer to home is more exciting for them. So I'm very open to it. Do we have other faculty in the room? How many faculty do we have? And are others able and also willing to let their students do? Yeah. So others? Mary Beth, how about you?
Yeah, I had a student, for example, my students write a book, a 5-chapter sequel to their favorite children's book in WRA through the semester. And I have to tell you, international students, I'm going to use my children's language, kill it. They kill, I have to do the thing. Okay. I have as a WRA instructor, I have my students write a 5-chapter sequel to their favorite children's book. And international students, day one, hand on the desk, or head on the desk, tears. Like, how am I gonna do that? That actually happened only once. The students who do this project, international students specifically, my children would say, kill the assignment. It's amazing, beautiful, extraordinary. work. One student said, well, Mrs. Heater, instead of using or writing a book, can I like do a diary, keep a diary? And that was something this student was more comfortable with, you know, absolutely. There are some things though where I've like pushed them as part of the curriculum. One is the students videotape themselves as part of a group. You can imagine how difficult that would be. And I'm like, well, together as a group, I want you to support one another and do it. And through the process, it's difficult, but I'm like, you can do this. I'm glad to help you. And but there's some sense of empowerment and some courage that has developed by doing the assignment. So it's finding that balance of how to you know, how to support, how to let go, how to allow them to have a voice, but also not to compromise some of the course expectations and the learning that they can do both psychosocially and academically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I agree with Mary Beth. I think it comes back to the course learning outcomes. If you're teaching an American history class or American politics class, it's probably going to have a lot of American examples. But I think if you're in a class where the learning outcome is really to understand governance or structures of government, I think, you know, we do desire to have global students. And I often say to faculty, it's good for them to be able to take information and apply it in multiple contexts. So when I'm teaching, I always try to have multiple contexts so they can see how it plays out differently, maybe in different parts of the world, or they can connect the local to the global, right? So I think there's a pedagogical aspect to it. And I also agree that, you know, for me, when I'm teaching, yeah, I want it to be something that connects to the student, because then they're going to be more passionate about writing it. But it still has to hit my learning outcomes, right? So I think that there's a balance, like Mary Beth said.
You have a question, Jenya?
Hello, my name is Jian Yang. From my name, you can know I originally from China. So I'm a PhD student in HELP program, and I'm also the cultural assistant at Neighborhoods. So I work a lot with Chinese international students at MSU. And most of my students I work close with, they are students who are either on academic probation or were on academic probation, or they were already recessed or dismissed by MSU. So like from my own like working experience with those students and talking with many faculty and administrators here, I feel like all the topics or the stories we are talking about today is related to students' problem-solving skills. Yeah, so if you cannot understand like the materials or your professors talking, is a problem and you need to solve this problem. And instead of like refer the student to the faculty member, that's all I always do, or refer them to the advisors. I always provide my own suggestions or some advice to the student, like how you can try to solve it by yourself. So, and another one, I think like, do not have any assumption about your students. So I have students like, just back to Patricia's idea, you tell students you can Google it, but not every Chinese internationals know how to Google. They don't know what is a website. Or even they are on the website, they don't know how I can Google. Yeah, just put in the keywords. Okay, what are the keywords? So those are very basic questions or the skills, but they don't really understand. And I also do a lot of things like Liz here. So I have the student, they need to appeal or need to go to a hearing. They don't know how to do it. So I tell them, like, you can write down something in Chinese. If you really don't know how to write down them in English, just write some pieces. So I found them like, English is not the biggest barrier for them. The biggest barrier for them is their literacy skills, even in Chinese. They can like do a very well like Chinese essay or composition. So that's their problem. That's their problem. But another thing I say is like, the students need we call it is like you hold the student's hand and show them do how step by step. Many Chinese international students need the guidance like this. You cannot just tell them like, okay, talk to your advisor, okay, talk to your professor. But they will ask, how? So after I have the conversation with my students, like, okay, I think this is the problems or some concerns you may have. So I provide them a list, like some key points for them. Like, okay, from my list, like number 1, you think it's a very, you think, okay, so I have a language skills issue. So what's your specific issue? Or is your vocabulary, is your grammar or something? Just fill in my form and try to prepare by yourself before you meet with my faculty member. So that's what my students need. And also many of my students, like they were recessed. So they need help on transfer. They don't know how to do the application. Yeah, I have a really, maybe you think that's a funny example. I have a student, he missed the deadline to transfer community college because he took action too late. So I asked him like, hey, you have like 3 months in China. Why you didn't do it? So he told me, well, I cannot use Google in China, it's blocked. And I need Google to find the community college website I want to apply. So I told him, hey, yeah, we cannot use Google in China, but we have Baidu. It's another word, a Chinese version in China. And we have Bing from Microsoft. We have other ways. So that's because I'm majoring in Hale, so we learn about like adult learning. And I feel like most of my students, they are not adults. They are emerging adults. So we need to pay attention to their psychological development. So, and I heard of like one psychologist from Peking Normal University. So he worked a lot with college students in China. So he said like, so Chinese students, usually their psychology development will be delayed. Usually is delayed like 3 to 5 years. In some cases, only delayed for 8 years. Usually like delayed for 8 years. So physically, they are 18 years old, but probably their psychological age is only 10 to 15. So how you can talk with those students, and they do not have any like support from their family. I always ask my students like, hey, did you talk this, your problem or issues with your family, blah, blah, blah. They're like, no, my parents don't understand me. I don't want to talk to them anymore. So that's the thing. So we are far away from the home, and they're very likely like to seek help among the community close to them. Usually means their close Chinese friends, or they just posted their problems or issues online on WeChat or BB. So, but they do not get the accurate information because it's the information from the students, not from MSU officials, right? So it's like how we can like encourage our students to make the connections with our staff, our faculty, our administrators, or other students among here. Yeah, I saw like a lot of like very great practices, but it's not for international students. It's for like domestic students or first-general low income, like the proactive advising one. So like maybe we could try like in the future to let your international students know you can talk to us, and don't worry about your English skills. We can understand you.
So much. Those are really good points. I think that there definitely are a lot of similarities that I see, and that I'm sure you see as well, among maybe first-generation college students and international students who come from places where the learning system is so different that their parents would not understand, what they're how to help them. So, comment, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, just
so
a comment that having taught at different places and different universities, the diversity, I feel in a way that in my classes I teach language, it works other ways. I have more Indian students than American or non-Indian students, so the other way, but I feel the connection is a very important part. It could be connection between the advisors and the faculty. I also did advising, and I know how I was talking to faculty when students were having problems enrolling in a class or passing the drop at period. At the same time, all these things we do at the university, in the university environment, but if the faculties are open to, or faculty is open to host some kind of lunch or dinner or something like a tea party or something like that, a small event that is not related to academics, but just learning the cultures and exchanging the cultures, that's important. Also, maybe at some point, universities will consider having a position like a faculty ambassador or something that is from that part of the globe, that South Asia or China, not just full Asia, like China or South Asia, because there was a student, and I have done this personally a lot of time at MSU and other places, that the students who are not my Hindi classes, but they're international students from India, I happen to meet them at a grocery store someplace and invite them over. They all come, and there are so many questions. For example, this guy from Pakistan needed coffee, and he was at a Starbucks. And he was telling me that I had to run to my class, and I was late, and everybody was like a long line, and I saw these 3 jars on the side, and I just got a cup and took a lot of filled it with the full milk, and went to the counter that I want to buy this. And the person at the counter was like, what is this? Because the person doesn't know that that milk is for like your tea that you put on top of your tea or coffee, but not just fill the cup with it. He thought there's no line, and I can just get it from there. So these are very small things that as people from other culture, they need to learn, and they can only learn when they interact, not in like academic setting, but out of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're gonna wrap up. So we finish on time. I just wanted to mention really quickly, I did hand out brochures about the International Student Support Program, which is a program available to all international students and students studying abroad. So I can tell you more about that if you're interested. And then I just wanted to thank our panelists as well for coming, and thank you all for coming to today's session.